listening to our amazing event. This event is sponsored by RTT, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, Climate Cardinals, and Physicians for Social Responsibility. Our speakers for today include Zhangeldy, Senior Counselor at the the Permanent Mission of Kazakhstan in New York, Benetick Kabua Maddison, the Assistant Director and Project Specialist for Youth, Climate, and Nuclear Issues at the Marshallese Educational Initiative, Sophia Kianni, and Jasmine Owens, Lead Organizer and Policy Coordinator of the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Program at Physicians for Social Responsibility. This event is the first event of a series on saving the planet. It is a timely discussion as members of the international community, states, affected communities, and youth prepare for the first meeting of state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which will be held in Vienna, Austria. At this meeting, states will discuss the implementation of Articles 6 and 7 on victims' assistance, environmental remediation, international cooperation, and assistance. These provisions are directly linked to the nexus between nuclear and climate justice. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Zhangeldy, Counselor at the Permanent Mission of Kazakhstan, who will discuss the legacy of nuclear testing in his country, as well as the project that we've been working on regarding the positive obligations of the TPNW. Please, the floor is yours, Zhangeldy.
Thank you very much, dear Christian, dear ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to join today's event, providing discussion on environmental and nuclear justice. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation for organizing this important event. Let me highlight some lessons learned by my country, Kazakhstan, where for 4 decades between 1949 and 1989, 456 explosions were carried at the Semipalatinsk test site, one of the largest of its kind. This unprecedented experiment has caused irreparable damage to human health and the environment, leading to high morbidity and mortality among the local population, combined with radioactive contamination of adjacent territories. In total, nearly 1.5 million people suffered from the horrors of nuclear explosions. Many affected communities in East Kazakhstan continue to reap horrific fruits of this tragic legacy even to this day. On August 29, 1991, having signed the historic decree that shut down the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site by the will of the people of my country, the first president of Kazakhstan showed the whole world an example of a responsible and decisive approach to preserving peace and humanity. Shortly after, Kazakhstan also made a voluntary and brave decision to completely renounce its nuclear weapons arsenal, the fourth largest in the world at that time. The closure of the nuclear test site in Kazakhstan, along with the renunciation of nuclear weapons, was a major tectonic shift in the existing global political paradigm, leading to the silencing of other major test sites around the world. It was not long before other nuclear test sites followed Semipalatinsk's lead in building collective momentum for the ban of nuclear testing as a global phenomenon. All these efforts eventually paved the way for the adoption in 1996 a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, which we call CTBT, which we hope will enter into force one day. After the closure of the test site, one of the priority tasks of Kazakhstan was the social rehabilitation of people and territories affected by prolonged nuclear tests. For this purpose, On the 18th of December 1992, the law on social protection of citizens affected by nuclear tests at the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site was adopted. It provides a number of measures for treatment, health improvement, rehabilitation, social protection of the population, and socioeconomic development of the territory of the former test site. Nowadays, the test site, from a potential cause of a nuclear crisis, has become an object of scientific research. A multi-level protection system was created to ensure reliable protection of hazardous facilities. 7 large projects have been implemented to rehabilitate contaminated areas. In general, scientific, technical, and engineering work, which ensured the safety of the former Semipalatinsk test site, still remains unprecedented in the world. It should be emphasized that the denuclearization of the test site took place within the framework of extensive interaction of Kazakhstan with other countries, namely the United States of America and the Russian Federation, as well as the international organizations, primarily the IAEA. And we express our deep gratitude to our partners for long-term and fruitful cooperation in this strategically important area. It should be noted that due to the lack of progress in disarmament, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has become a new reality. And my country actively engaged in the negotiation process on the TPNW as a country that has traversed an ambitious path as a leader in nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Kazakhstan and Kiribati lay out a proposal and timetable for an informal working group that will provide a forum for discussion and collective action on the topics of positive obligation and universalization of the TPNW. It will include and already included a working paper that together with our colleagues from the civil society and academia, and of course with it owing to the tireless efforts by Christian, a working paper has been prepared, and now we are finalizing its discussion in order to submit it as a part of the documentation of the first meeting of the states parties to the TPNW to be held in Vienna in June this year. Our 2 countries have proposed to highlight the importance of promoting and implementing Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty. And these articles specifically focus on examining victim assistance, environmental remediation, international cooperation and assistance. And we encourage active participation by all states, international organizations, civil society groups, survivors, and affected communities. We also call on other states to join the treaty, hoping to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons by the centenary of the United Nations in 2045, as it's been proposed by the first president of Kazakhstan. So my country was the first one to set the example of convincing governments to halt nuclear tests around the world through its popular movement. And the wider involvement of youth with their zeal and dynamism, together with all segments of civil society, can also have an immense impact to mobilize action and influence governments to change their stance. And our group on working group on positive obligations is one of them, in order to convince that the humanitarian impact of nuclear testing and the existence of nuclear weapons may have extremely negative consequences for our future generations and current one. I'm happy to discuss further questions, and I'm grateful again for the organizers and for your attention. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Zhangeldy. Next will be Mr. Benetick Kabua Maddison of the Marshallese Educational Initiative, who will give a presentation about the legacy of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands and we'll touch upon A Journey Home, which is a new multimedia project that Reverse the Trend and MEI have been working on. Please, the floor is yours, Benetick.
Thank you, Christian. I wish to thank the organizers and other speakers for addressing the critical issue of nuclear and environmental justice. I am pleased to share the effects of nuclear testing and climate change in the Marshall Islands and what Marshallese are doing today to address these twin issues. I can still remember it like yesterday. My elementary school principal pulled my first grade classmates and me out of class to gather at the school library for a show and tell that she wanted to share with us. To my surprise, the presentation was about her trip to the Marshall Islands that year. She showed us photos and talked about the 8,000-mile journey from Arkansas to the Marshall Islands. For a trip that long, patience was not on her side. She was eager to set foot on Marshallese soil, but had to make a layover in Hawaii for a couple of hours to connect flights. And off she went on her second flight. From Hawaii to the Marshall Islands, they could see clouds and the ocean below them. No sights of islands yet. She waited and waited until out of nowhere, there they were, God's long-lost emerald necklaces floating on the water, as if they had just risen from the depths of the sea as the plane was making its way to Midillo, the capital of the Marshall Islands. When I saw the photos, it was a very emotional moment. As a first grader, I did not have access to a computer because first graders did not use computers then. My parents had those old Nokia phones that did not have access to the internet yet. And so seeing my homeland again for the first time in photos with the beautiful white sandy beaches, the lush green forests, and the blue turquoise water after leaving a few years prior gave me tears and a big smile. It was comforting to know at a young age that my homeland was still there. Even though I am physically here in the States, thousands of miles away, my heart is still back home. The Marshall Islands have been the home of my people for more than 4,000 years. We have survived living on these islands for this long, even though they are isolated with scarce resources. But I credit our survival to the cultural values of our ancestors that we, their descendants, are still embracing today. The cultural values of love, respect, kindness, and togetherness are essential aspects of our close-knit society. Our cultural values are not only reserved for people, but also the environment. Marshallese culture, if one takes the time to learn about it, is also based on sustainability and conservation. For example, traditional Marshallese canoes are made from natural materials such as coconut fronds and breadfruit trees, to name a few. Several other examples are hand-woven baskets, necklaces, hats, bags, navigational stick charts, and many other handicrafts made from natural materials too. And when making canoes, homes, or crafts in general, Marshallese artisans and builders are careful not to overproduce to ensure enough resources for future generations. It is also the same with fishing and gathering food. People, especially those living on the outer islands, continue to embrace the lifestyles of our ancestors. Unfortunately, the sustainable Marshallese way of life is under threat. The Marshall Islands are on the front line of the climate crisis, and while others may think climate change is years or decades away, it is already impacting vulnerable places like the Marshalls. Yet we are only responsible for a small, teeny tiny bit of the total global emissions. Relatives and friends back home have said that some of the beaches that my family and I used to enjoy 20 years ago are no longer there. The islands are prone to extreme drought and flooding conditions that have worsened over the years, leading to food and water shortages for the people. The Marshall Islands is also faced with the issues of coral bleaching due to our oceans warming up and overfishing by foreign fishing vessels. These environmental problems and exploitations of our resources will continue to force more Marshallese to migrate to the US to seek better opportunities for themselves and their families. These are not all the environmental problems in the Marshall Islands, though. Marshallese are faced with the stark reality that we may someday lose our homeland if the world continues the path of destruction. The islands are on average 6 feet above sea level, and to make matters worse, the nuclear legacy left behind by the US is still there. Between 1946 and 1958, the US tested 67 nuclear weapons, or equivalent to 7,200 Hiroshima bombs. In the mid-1970s, the US built a concrete dome on Eniwetok called the Runa Dome. Eniwetok is one of the 2 islands used for nuclear testing. They dumped nuclear waste into the structure, which is now leaking nuclear contaminants into the fragile environment. Scientists have warned the Marshallese government that if the islands were underwater today, the dome would break open and release its deadly contents. As a result of the nuclear testing program, the Marshall Islands and the US signed the first Compact of Free Association in 1986, allowing Marshallese to migrate to the US for employment, education, and other reasons. We are not only experiencing the ecological effects of the nuclear test, but biological as well. We have some of the highest rates of cancer, diabetes, and other nuclear-related diseases. And during the pandemic, the Marshallese community suffered greatly. Many members of our community, many of them elders, passed away due to COVID-19, and data have shown that Marshallese are more prone to getting COVID-19 due to health issues that we have inherited from the nuclear legacy. The Marshall Islands has a long history of environmental advocacy, dating back to the early years of the US Trust Territory, an agreement between the United States and the United Nations that solidified the US's use of the Marshall Islands for nuclear testing. Together with allies worldwide, Marshallese leaders and community members have been fighting for nuclear and climate justice for decades. With the help of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, the Marshall Islands sued the 9 nuclear weapon states in 2014. Although the case was not won, the issue received international attention and support. The following year, desperate for bold climate actions, the Marshall Islands, under the late Tony DeBruyn, brought together 190 plus countries to support the Paris Climate Agreement through a group the RMI created called the High Ambition Coalition. The Marshallese Educational Initiative collaborates with the Reverse the Trend, the RMI National Nuclear Commission, and affected communities to continue raising awareness about the effects of nuclear and climate through panels, presentations, advocacy work, and webinars like the one we have today. Recently, the Marshall Islands and the US governments are renegotiating the next Compact of Free Association. It is my hope and that of my people that the next compact will address many of the problems facing my people, including the twin issues of nuclear and climate change. I now would like to share a recording of A Journey Home with you all. It is a poem by Marshallese youth in Arkansas with the help of the Reverse the Trend's lovely Yamayam and Christian Ciobanu. The poem is about the importance of home, whether it be Arkansas, where the largest concentration of Marshallese resides outside of the Marshall Islands, our planet, or the Marshall Islands. Land is an essential part of Marshallese culture. The total land area in the Marshall Islands is 70 square miles. It is all the land we have. For us Marshallese, time is running out. The US, the world, well, all of us, must do more to create a nuclear-free and livable planet for all, not to only survive, but thrive. And so that future Marshallese generations will live with the comfort of knowing that they have a home to go back to, and so that they can preserve and protect their culture for many more years to come. Thank you.
A journey home. My feet move through fresh mud after the rain. Spring leaves crunch under my shoes, careful not to step on the many-legged creatures that call this place home. Clouds appear when I breathe out. This earth is my home too. I find new paths every day, souls full of memories that I have made. Home is in the stillness of trees that flank the rugged road winding into miles and miles of breathtaking wild. Home is in the loud hooting during football games, woo, pig, suey, and the crisp hiss of a soda can pried open on a summer day. Home is in the riot of my bedroom, where purple string lights dangle like dancing punk fairies as I sing along loops of my favorite songs. I find home when I travel, like that one time in Seattle, a city that smells of brine brewed from the sea. Skinned fish and homemade cheese sit pretty under the patter of rain and the squabble of seagulls bathing in the bay. But there is one home I long for, the Marshall Atolls, daughters of the ocean, forged by primordial coral. They call my name. My feet move through the sand, damp from the waves. They pull me. Palms seek the cool touch of sea foam like delicate lace. These islands are my inheritance, earthly gems under opulent stars. But I cannot walk further. The water is a terrifying mood, eating away the island lagoons, seawalls battered, now crumbling. Storms split the leaning palms, the same ones swallowed by nuclear plumes many years ago. Men gave atom bombs a place in world history. But what about this home? Smudged out of the story, I fear people only saw the dirty red cloud and not the bruised earth below. In the future, will these island daughters sink to the ocean floor? I fear people only see a drowned land instead of an earth worth saving. These questions stump me, but still I stitch a map to connect what matters most. My family, my culture, my Marshall Island home. A map of the Marshalls, not as a place, but a people to guide a future generation whose feet will meet the islands with love and without fear. But I long to find a path towards home, the emerald countryside or the blue Pacific tides that will stay safe, where my children can tumble into a beautiful brightness and feel earth a stable bedrock under their newly formed souls, while their little palms, fingers splayed, reach for the sky, a limitless canvas where time is constant and still.
Thank you so much, Benetick. That was extremely powerful. And I should mention that we're in the process of animating the video, the poem, which we presented in Vienna on the margins of the first meeting of state parties of the TPNW. Lovely Umayam of Bomb Shelto and Catherine Kilo are working on the animation, and we're looking forward to presenting the video and sharing it with all of you soon. Right now, we're waiting for our speaker, Sophia Kianni, to join us. But in the meantime, her colleague, Hikaru from Cardinals, will say a few words about the organization as we wait for her. Please, Hikaru.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to reiterate that the poem was powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Benedict. So yeah, I can briefly talk about Climate Cardinals. So Climate Cardinals was established during the pandemic in 2019 as an international youth-led nonprofit that very much focuses on environmental justice. Specifically, we focus on making the climate movement more accessible to those who don't speak English. And we do this primarily through translating and distributing climate research and information. So for example, we've done several translations for different UN organizations, as well as several partners working specifically with youth primarily, but also with other translation nonprofits. as well as other youth organizations that have been translating research within their own communities. And our pillars of work have primarily been focused on values, purpose, and impact. So Climate Cardinals' mission primarily is to educate and to produce research or to translate research that is apolitical and rooted in science in order to make sure that this information is accessible. And to this date, since 2019, we've grown to have over 5,000 volunteers in 29 countries, as well as to offer services in about 105 languages. So in terms of how Climate Cardinals was first founded, you'll surely hear more about this from Sophia when she joins. But Sophia Kianni is Iranian American. And she realized the need for climate translation services when she would visit Iran with her family in middle school. She was shocked to see that the pollution in Iran was so bad that she couldn't see the stars at night. And she brought up these concerns to her relatives, but was shocked when they informed her that they knew almost nothing about climate change. So Sophia was determined to help learn with them about what was going on within their community. So she translated the research that she had been looking at into Farsi after realizing that for them, scientific research was inaccessible. And after reading Sophia's translations, her relatives changed their habits over the years and reduced their use of cars and shopping in order to be more sustainable. And through those experiences, Sophia realized the opportunity to make the climate movement more accessible to non-English speakers. For example, a Google search would reveal that the vast majority of documents about climate change are in English. And I think there's two times as many documents in English as there are in French and Mandarin, which are the second and third languages with the most documents and research about climate change. So within Climate Cardinals, we have several different youth teams and we're all volunteers. So it's a primarily youth organization. And we operate with international relations team, a fundraising team, and a partnerships team, and so on. But most important is the part of our organization that's focused on translation, which I've already spoken about a little bit. And in terms of the impact that we've seen throughout the past few years, in terms of our translation services, we've been able to work with different international organizations and nonprofits. And something that's been also really important for us is, in terms of expanding who we're reaching, is to also focus on making sure that we're also serving communities that are underrepresented, but also don't receive as much information, since I guess the other sort of difficulty with working with youth organizations or working with volunteers is that, you know, certain people will have more time to spend time, and also because of that, the documents that we tend to translate or the interests that are reflected will sometimes reflect those of our organization. So something that we've also been focusing on is expanding chapters. So having student groups that translate environmental research that affects their own community, and also partnering with different organizations, especially within indigenous communities, as well as communities that have been disproportionately impacted by climate change, as well as disproportionately impacted by the recent pandemic, as we've seen how interconnected these issues are, and how these crises exacerbate and highlight inequities that already exist within society and worsen them as well. Yeah, so I guess I believe that Sophia is here now. So thank you for listening, and I also very much appreciate the opportunity to collaborate, and I'll pass it along to Christian, and then I guess Sophia will get started.
Yes, thank you so much, Hikaru. I would like to give the floor to Sophia Kianni, who is the founder and CEO of Climate Cardinals. Please, the floor is yours, Sophia.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia, and I am a 20-year-old Iranian-American climate activist. I'm excited to speak to you all about my journey as a climate activist, how I first got started, what motivates me, and what the progression has looked like, as well as sharing some lessons generally about what I think some key takeaways from my work are. So when I was 12 years old, I took a 2-month trip to Iran, which is my parents' home country. I grew up visiting Iran in the summers. And while I was there, it was right after I had my first class ever about climate change in 6th grade. And so while I was there, I was struck by how horrible the pollution in Iran was. It was so bad that I couldn't see the stars at night. And I also learned about climate change in the Middle East. I learned that temperatures there were rising more than twice the global average. And it was my first time really seeing the impacts of climate change and how it was affecting these marginalized populations. And so I decided to talk to my relatives about this issue. And I was shocked when they told me that they didn't know anything about climate change or global warming. These were terms that were really foreign to them. And I wanted to be able to teach my relatives about what I had learned in school. So I was scouring the internet, and it was very hard for me to find resources that were available in Farsi, which is Iran's native language. And I even found a study that read only 5% of Iranian students could properly explain the greenhouse gas effect. So it was clearly this systematic issue of a lack of climate education available in Iran. And so I decided to work with my mom to translate climate resources into Farsi, since I was unable to find them on my own. And so I taught my relatives about climate change, and it was really incredible to me to see how they felt so shocked and appalled by what was happening to them. And I think that it also was helpful for them to be able to identify what the causes were of the increased weather disasters that they were seeing, particularly since Iran does struggle with issues like drought, and there had been flooding in recent years in different areas in the country. And so that's the experience that I had in middle school. And then in high school, I decided that I was really passionate about climate change. Seeing the impact that climate education was able to have on my relatives really inspired me. And so I decided to work with a variety of different grassroots climate organizations, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, Zero Hour, some of the largest youth-led climate organizations in the world. And it was an incredible experience to see what young people were capable of when we all worked together and collaborated. We were able to mobilize millions of people to get out into the streets and strike in 2019 when we had the global youth climate strikes. It was truly incredible and inspiring to see what my peers were capable of accomplishing. But even through those experiences, I realized that although I was working with some of the foremost climate activists in the world, we were still only putting out most of our information in English. Like, there was no translations happening. And I couldn't help but think that people like my relatives were being left out of really crucial, critical conversations. And the majority of materials and petitions that we were putting out were completely inaccessible to them. And so I wanted to work with these organizations to implement translation programs, but I soon realized that the issue of climate translation was one far bigger than just one organization. And so I decided that I wanted to start my own nonprofit, which is Climate Cardinals, which is an international youth-led nonprofit working to make climate education more accessible to people who don't speak English. And so we've grown to over 8,000 volunteers in 40 countries, and we've translated hundreds of thousands of words of climate information into over 100 languages. And I always like to joke, like, this started out as just me and my mom. And then I recruited like a few of my friends to work for me. And then we had this viral TikTok video on the first day that we launched that was able to reach hundreds of thousands of people. And that really is what mobilized these thousands of young volunteers to sign up to work with us. And we now also have incredible directors who help with running the day-to-day operations and coordinating events. And so it's been really inspiring for me to see that I've been able to really galvanize and capitalize off of the momentum and enthusiasm of young people in order to accomplish this incredible task. And around 6 months after I started Climate Cardinals, I was nominated to the United Nations inaugural Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, which has been an incredible experience in and of itself, because I soon realized after joining the UN that the UN languages actually count for less than half of the world's speaking population. So the majority of people on our planet are unable to understand the documents and agreements that are being issued by the world's highest international political body. Specifically, when you're talking about the issue of climate change and you're looking at reports and documents like the IPCC report, that is the foremost authority on the state of the planet, the fact that that was inaccessible to like half of the planet really made me think that there was a way that Climate Cardinals could play a role in furthering accessibility, specifically within the context of the UN. And so some of our biggest, most successful collaborations have been, we worked with UNICEF to translate their report on the impacts of climate change on children. We also worked with the UNEP to translate this manifesto they had on the importance of biodiversity action. We then worked with the Italian government to translate the outcomes of the Youth for Climate conference. And collectively, I mean, we've been able to really, I think, have one of the largest impacts specifically within the context of the UN, just because we've been able to raise awareness to the fact that many young people, specifically at conferences like COP and Youth for Climate, felt like it was very hard for them to participate because of this language barrier. And I do think that many of the organizations and institutions that I've been communicating with are now so much more cognizant and aware of the issue of language accessibility in the climate movement, and have been doing a much better job to actively seek out ways to translate, whether that be partnering with us, working with professional translations. I definitely think that the advocacy and awareness that I've been able to bring to the issue has really been the best part of the experience for me. I was fortunate to be able to give a TED Talk on the topic, which now has over 1 million views. And so I'm really glad that more people have thought critically about how we can continue to uplift marginalized communities by including them in these conversations that we're having. So yeah, that is my story. That's how Climate Cardinals came about. I would love to answer any questions you guys have, but I hope that my story shows that if you ever witness an injustice happening in your community, or you feel like there's a way that you can make the world a better place, I really do encourage you to go for it, and you will be so surprised by the outpouring of support and resources that you'll be able to receive.
Thank you so much, Sophia. So we'll do questions at the end. I would, and it was just like incredibly empowering to hear, your thoughts and what climate, how Climate Cardinals formed. I would like to now pass the floor to Jasmine Owens, PSR Physicians for Social Responsibility, who will just bring everything together and talk about climate and nuclear justice. So please, Jasmine, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi everyone. Impressive speakers to follow up, I will say. But I will do my best to kind of bring all of this together and talk about some paths forward. As we've seen, there's very clear intersections between environmental and nuclear justice. Benetick was talking about the Run-It Dome in the Marshall Islands and how, all of that radioactive waste is threatening to be released into the environment due to climate change. And the fact that their islands are completely altered forever. And so many Marshallese cannot go home because of this. Thinking about, the Diné, the Navajo, in the Southwest United States. And Sophia's talk really made me think about how back when the United States first started mining uranium within our country, that they never even told the Diné, what they were mining and the dangers of it, and didn't even give them proper protective gear when they were mining, which, exposed them to lethal amounts of radiation while they were mining without their knowledge. And because they couldn't speak English, and, the government didn't bother to try and cross that language barrier and inform them of the dangers that they were getting involved in. And so it really makes me think about the importance of language within security and our safety and the way that works. And as well, thinking about the ways that climate change can, spawn conflicts that could potentially go nuclear, thinking about how climate change was, one of the triggers that led to the Syrian civil war, and the ways that in the future, as our lands become more and more decimated and resources become more and more scarce, the ways that, people with this fear of survival what that could lead to. So there's so many ways that our environment and climate change and nuclear weapons intersect. There's a reason that people refer to them as, the twin existential threats, because they truly are that. Climate change, the climate crisis is here already, and it's only going to get worse if we don't act now and do more to try and combat it. And with the existence of nuclear weapons, we all could cease to exist in 30 minutes or less, as long as these weapons exist. Like, that threat will always be there. And so the ways that I think we can kind of move forward and try and see more progress on getting our governments to actually listen to us and actually do something to adequately combat climate change and to actually live up to their commitments to creating a safer world and getting rid of their nuclear weapons is coming together, kind of what Sophia was talking about as well, being able to join forces and join our resources and our strengths and come together as one movement, to kind of show the government and the world that, we're serious about this and that action needs to be taken now, is how we can do this. I think about one particular issue that is driving a lot of both of these problems is the military and the ways that, the United States and other countries around the world prioritize, the military and militarization and this two-dimensional idea of security over, the actual needs of people. I just saw today that, new analysis that global military spending topped $2.1 trillion last year for the first time ever. And over 38% of that was from the US alone. We have Biden proposing an $813 billion defense budget, which, this includes funding for nukes for next year. And this is just a starting point. It's likely that it will be higher than this because Congress just continues to throw money at the government or at the military without thinking about how it's actually being used, which is awful because the US military has been proven to have just awful fiscal responsibility. They've never passed an audit. More than half of the money that we give them, our taxpayer money, just goes to defense contractors, and it doesn't actually make us safer. We need to start demanding that Congress and the administration and our governments around the world, that they need to understand that security and safety are so much more than just the military and what the military can do. The military will not save us from climate change. They are actively exacerbating the problem. Security, it has to include centering our collective humanity and understanding that, the ways that we are human are what will drive our safety in this movement. The ways that we center, our stories. Benetick and talking about, his teacher with those photos coming back from the Marshall Islands and seeing his homeland for the first time in years. And, the ways that Sophia was, ignited by this lack of knowledge of her family members, not of their own accord, but of a lack of interest in trying to ensure that people are well aware of what's going on, and the ways that drove her to create her own nonprofit to make sure that, climate change is accessible to everyone. It shows that we really have to rethink the ways that we approach security and safety. And that means, coming together across borders, across fields, across movements, and demanding that our leaders do better and actually follow through on their commitments. We don't have time to waste. We've heard it here that the climate crisis, it's already happening and it's only going to get worse. The nuclear risk is very high. And, with the war in Ukraine, that has been exacerbated even further. But I truly believe in the power of younger generations to come together and fight these fights. I've seen it in this meeting, listening to Sophia and, Hikaru and Benetick and everyone. I've had, seen it in conversations I've had on social media, just seeing the ways that young people are taking to the streets, coming up with the most innovative and inventive ways to call attention to our declining futures. And I firmly believe that if we're able to come together and combine our resources and strength, we can make major changes that will hopefully offer us a better future than what we've been handed thus far, and can actually make progress on combating and mitigating climate change, and actually seeing some successes in getting rid of more nuclear weapons and bringing us closer to a world free without them. And so while it may seem overwhelming and bleak and very frustrating to have to continuously feel like we're just screaming into a void on these issues, I do have hope. And I do think that, we will prevail, and that justice will prevail, and that we can really combat these issues if we come together and really just, show them what we got. That is my hope. And I know that every time that I, look at my peers and those younger than me, that, we'll be okay. And with that, I will end it there. We can go on to a Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Jasmine. I think it was very powerful. So we're going to go into the Q&A now. If you have any questions, please either raise your hand or post them in the chat box. We have a question, and I'm going to try to summarize it. It's for Benetick, actually, in terms of, and this is continuing the theme about combining forces and the power of the younger generation. If you could talk about young Marshallese youth and what their demands are in terms of the compact agreement, that would be fantastic. So please, Benetick.
Thank you, Kristen. So as I mentioned a while ago, the U.S. and the Marshall Islands are negotiating the next Compact of Free Association. The compact expires next year. We're talking about the financial side of it. And really, the Marshallese government has not reached out to the Marshallese communities or the diaspora to give their input on what the next compact should look like. But the Compact of Free Association, although it stems from the nuclear testing program, it does not address any of the biological and ecological effects of the nuclear testing. Really, my hope, as well as for others in my community, is that, first thing that needs to happen is we need to hear an official apology from the United States for the wrongs that they have committed on my people, as well as our homeland. They also need to release all of the classified documents that we have been asking for decades. The first Compact of Free Association, in fact, when it was signed in 1986, there were still so many information that our first government did not know about. But it was until the 90s when the Clinton administration decided to release classified information. And the government then said, wait a minute, why did we sign the first Compact of Free Association when these new information are now coming up? And so really this next Compact of Free Association is probably the one that will determine, the future of the Marshallese people. And it is essential that the voices of young people be heard, because we will be the ones to inherit these problems. and we are still fighting for nuclear justice. And that is why I'm grateful to, Christian and others for providing platforms like this so that we can share with the world the Marshallese narrative when it comes to these issues that we're still dealing with.
Thank you, Benedict. And as a follow-up, if you could describe how you have been engaging with members of Congress. I know that recently actually several months ago in November, you had the opportunity to meet with Representative Katie Porter. So if you could discuss that, that would be great.
Yes, so I had the opportunity alongside Christian and several others from MEI to meet with Congresswoman Katie Porter. And she has been very active when it comes to this nuclear legacy, because like Congresswoman Katie Porter and many people in this country are not aware of this history, despite the fact that it's American history. And so in my talk or in my discussion with the representative, I pretty much said that more needs to be done to address these issues moving forward. Because if I were to describe the relationship between the United States and the Marshall Islands, I would say is toxic. It's a toxic relationship because it's a relationship that is not based on trust, accountability, or transparency. And like I said, there are still numerous documents that have yet to be released to the Marshallese people. And so there is no closure without full disclosure. And so moving forward, we want a relationship that we're treated as equals and not as, nothing. Because even to this day, we still have trust issues with the US government in particular, just because many of our people are dying. We haven't achieved justice yet. And so that's why it's very critical that the voices of my people, particularly young people, be heard in these compact negotiations.
Thank you, Benedict. There's also a question in the chat box by Gwen Dubois. The question is there a role for Americans to help advocate for justice for RMI, for the Republic of the Marshall Islands?
Absolutely. Learning about the history and teaching it to others, because this again is American history. Everywhere I go and share about our narrative, I always get people saying, I did not know this. And it's not surprising because this knowledge is not taught in the classrooms. When you open the American history book, the only images of the bombs you see are the ones that were detonated on Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but never the 67 nuclear weapons that were detonated in the Marshall Islands. So educating the American public, and then 2, reaching out to your elected officials. You'll be surprised by how many elected officials in this country are not aware of the Compact of Free Association, even though it's American law. They're not aware that there's a country called the Marshall Islands, nor are they aware that the United States tested nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. And I experienced this when I went to Washington, D.C. with several other Marshallese to advocate for the return of the Medicaid program for Marshallese, which we were kicked off of back in 1996. And as my fellow Marshallese from other states were lobbying their elected officials from their states, they were surprised to learn that their officials were not aware of any of this. And so, you know, education, reaching out to your elected officials, you know, it's what I would encourage you to do.
Thank you, Benetick. Now, I have received a question for Zhangeldy, the mission of Kazakhstan. The question is whether you could discuss the role of civil society and youth, your thoughts about the positive obligations and how young people can really help support those, you know, initiatives contained in the working paper, and then what you hope to achieve in Vienna. And I think in this regard, perhaps you can talk about the International Trust Fund idea, Zhangeldy.
Thank you, Christian. International Trust Fund is one of our practical ideas how to contribute to the Article 6 and 7 of the TPNW. And given the principle of inclusiveness, we've been working closely with the civil society representatives, academia, experts, including people from the younger generations. And the International Trust Fund, in our view, is to be a sort of fund that any state party to the treaty, non-state party, or even an individual would be able to contribute financially or in other ways. For example, my country, we can contribute by sharing our experience on the remediation of the contaminated areas. We've had a solid experience of our National Nuclear Center. They can provide consultations, some training exercises. And of course, this is also a good opportunity for developing countries where nuclear testings took place to start this environmental remediation activities to be implemented on their territory. And how can we contribute? We can contribute either by providing financial support and ask specialists or special agencies to come and help. Or we can share with our experience, we can bring our experts to assess the how far is the territory is contaminated, and also help to take local people to the hospitals, or maybe provide necessary equipment for their hospitals, including something from the nuclear medicine. This all kind of practical arrangements that we are planning to adopt at the first meeting of the states parties. And this is also a thought for discussions and for our joint work at the intersessional period after the first meeting of the states parties. So we have to keep going and keep this in our agenda. And of course, in parallel, we are working in raising awareness of the humanitarian impact of nuclear testing and nuclear weapons themselves. And without the support of the civil society, especially from the youth representatives, we cannot achieve our goal. And only this global movement would be helpful in in urging the governments to come together and support and discuss possible ways of eliminating nuclear weapons because their existence is a threat to our humanity. And you've probably seen this since the recent developments in our region have been taking place. And so now the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is, it's real and it's dangerous than ever before. That is why the civil society people, young generations, academia, all of them should persuade parliamentarians, the governments to start discussions on joining the TPNW or any other nuclear weapons banning international agreement. If these countries are not happy with the TPNW, we can bring to the agenda a new one, but it's all about the goodwill and the readiness to discuss and have such a cooperation. Otherwise, non-proliferation is not sufficient nowadays. We have to bring disarmament, to promote this idea in order to achieve our common goal, which have been shared by the whole United Nations community, is to reach the world without nuclear weapons. That's the only guarantee of our future and the future generations to survive and to a safer world. I hope I answered your question, Christian.
Yes, thank you, Zhangeldy. So now we have a question for Sophia. The question is, how are you bridging the learning gap and interpreting into multiple languages? Sophia, are you on? You're still on. Fortunately, it looks like Sophia is no longer with us. So I'll go to the next question, which is for Jasmine, which is on if you could talk about how we can overcome the feeling of apathy when it comes to change, or overcome the narrative that it is already too late in terms of addressing the situation with climate.
That's a big one. How to overcome apathy. It's hard. I've experienced it within my own work trying to get rid of nuclear weapons. And I've, experienced it witnessing the climate catastrophes that are happening around the world and just the gross negligence by governments to do really anything about it. And it can be very difficult to overcome those feelings and continue fighting. But for me, the way that I do it is I use that to fuel me. I find myself, I often get very angry when I read about these atrocities and what's going on. And, I think it's important to allow yourself to have a moment to sit in those feelings and, let them, just let yourself feel them, but then understand that, the fight still has to go on and it's still going on, and we can continue this until, our last breath, but we have the time to do it. And, and it's really difficult. It's not easy, but I think what helps is in our movement work and in our work to, combat climate change and abolish nuclear weapons, it's really important to remind ourselves of our humanity and to kind of balance these, negative feelings with joy and happiness and love, and trying to remind ourselves of the joys of life and what we're fighting for. Because I feel like that for me has been really helpful in trying to overcome these, feelings of apathy or, dealing with the grief of just, not really having much of a future now, and the grief of having to just learn about what's going on and all of the violence and death and just awfulness that people are having to deal with all around the world on a daily basis. So for me, I think it's really important that as much as our work focuses on these tough topics, we should also make time for joy and for happiness and for love, and making sure that we really bring all parts of our humanity into our work and understand that, you know, that's how we can keep moving. I think that's why so much of what's been going on has been able to happen, is because, you know, those on the other side have been so effective at, you know, removing our humanity from the conversation, not talking about the human impacts of what they're doing, and, you know, not in, you know, creating this lack of education, just knowledge around these issues and what's going on. Because like Benetick and Sophia were saying, it's a lot of people don't know, you know, what's going on. You know, we work on this, we understand it, but other people don't. And so bringing this to their attention and like making it clear what's going on and the ways that these issues intersect and how we can solve them, I think that's so important. And what that entails is talking about the human impacts, talking about the ways that these affect us on all levels of our humanity, you know, both physical and emotional and spiritual and, you know, cultural and communal, all of it. I think that's really how we can overcome those feelings and continue to do this work.
Thank you so much. I know that we're over time. Perhaps very briefly, I want to acknowledge that we have this really fantastic elder from the Navajo First Nation who's on this call. Her name's